Meow meow.
Intro, the goal. Hi kittens! In this video, I walk you through my process for making my character Eliza into a face-tracked 2D model. If you ever wondered how VTuber avatars are made, or are interested in commissioning one, or want to know if you have what it takes to make your own, this is the video for you. So, here's what we want to achieve. This character is piloted by my facial expressions I make in front of a webcam and custom animations I can trigger with a keystroke. To make this, first we need Part 1. The character. The character Eliza was already existing and I had drawn art of her beforehand. After all, she's a mascot for one of my website projects. As you can see, her design varied a bit over the several drawings I made of her. A proper model sheet wasn't existing at that point. I had a few light changes in mind to improve and tighten her design a little before I start with the drawing for a rig. I liked and wanted to keep most of her features: reddish skin tone, violet demon parts, glasses, light blonde to silvery hair. She was supposed to appear knowledgeable, so I aimed for a face that looked roughly 35 to 40 years old when I created her. I changed that to 30 years old, for example, to make her appear more active and approachable. The face was the thing I fiddled around with a lot, since you connect with that the most, especially in a face-tracked avatar. I finally ended up with this sketch and felt content to move on to Part 2. The illustration. Since we are making a 2D model and not a 3D one, we need a proper drawing to start out, or rather a set of drawings. Drawings for rigging have a few special requirements. The biggest difference is that each individual part of the character, like arms, hands, legs, need to be on its own layer, and the overlapping parts you usually don't see need to be drawn in as well. I'm making one layer for each part's outline first, and then double that by adding a second layer to fill in the base color. At this point, the color itself doesn't matter yet, since I'm using it to distinguish parts and see if it's clean enough. It's most important to get the shapes and outlines right at this point. After I added the color layer to each part, I can fill it with the right color and add some color variation. My tool of choice is Photoshop. However, you can use almost any digital drawing program that supports layers and PSD files for a 2D model. As you may have noticed, I already drew the sketch symmetrical and continue to draw mostly with symmetry on through my whole drawing. This isn't a strict requirement for 2D models, but it makes producing them a lot faster, especially when your goal is something like a face tracking avatar, since you'll be able to copy features from one side to another later. Ideally, the position the character is drawn in needs to be neutral, like a default facial expression you want the character to have most of the time. Subtle changes in the drawing, while we will manipulate them a lot later, will affect the whole feel of the character. It's best to pay extra attention to detail here. Speaking of detail, the higher the resolution of this drawing, the better. Later, we will manipulate the individual layers to stretch, where we will need the extra resolution for, or the stretched part will get pixelated. Also, some parts will be distorted heavier than others. Like the mouth will twist into a smile, but the hoof will barely move. For that moment, we need some parts to have higher resolution than others. We can always make one part take up less pixels later to improve performance, but never increase the pixel count after we finish our drawing. So, to get the best quality possible, it's best to work on the highest resolution your computer can handle decently. I went with a resolution of 7407 pixels wide and 15,000 pixels high, to give you an idea on just how big I worked. It's pretty popular to go with the thin outline anime style for VTubers these days. I like my outlines a little thicker though. It fits my personality better. For a 2D model, almost any style will work. The more realistic ones get exponentially more complicated though. When I start shading, I add new layers for each shadow and clip them to the base color layer. I start with a solid brush blocking in shadows. For the softer parts, I use a mixture of a basic soft brush and a watercolor brush to give Eliza some texture. This is how we will get some interesting details in our drawing. For the hair highlights, for example, I'm using a splatter brush. I feel small details like these give a unique twist and make my drawing stand out more in the big ocean that is anime art. You can see I'm still experimenting with details on Eliza, like with another type of color or the color of her eyelashes. Since I was open to work on her design for the model, I checked out some variations I thought could be an improvement from time to time during the process. From this point on, I'm just adding more shadow and highlight layers to achieve an appealing character art. As you can see, it's a painstaking process with literally thousands of layers and will take much longer than just a regular drawing. To be fair, if you don't end up fiddling everything to perfection like I do, you could probably do with some less. A good layer structure is a must though. I colored all my layer groups to stay organized. If you have art you want to turn into a model that doesn't fit the requirements I've listed so far, don't worry. In that case, you would need to cut out the individual pieces first and then fill in the missing parts. This is also Sever's most rigorous offer. I've drawn the whole model art over the span of several days. Leaving your work to come back to the next day does wonders to your perception. You'll notice errors you haven't noticed before. This is why you see small jumps here and there where I went back to change things, like skin color and such. Taking extra care while drawing a model is important. It's increasingly difficult to make changes after we start rigging, although it is possible to change out parts later. Low quality or laziness will cause you trouble during rigging. That's why I advise to really go the extra mile. After the shading is finished, I add a backlight on top of my parts. Usually I colorize the outlines of my drawings, but I decided against it for my model deliberately. With black outlines and a bright backlight, the character will be able to stand out in front of all kinds of backgrounds. Since it's an avatar, it will be put in all kinds of scenes. I want to make sure it works in every environment. I wanted to give Eliza 3 outfit options: fully clothed, bikini and naked. Each outfit set requires to have new individual parts and individual layers again. Since I never drew her other than a bikini or naked before, I got to design what I imagined her clothing to look like. A sexy uniform with a tag seemed fitting for a mascot. I experimented a little until I was happy with the blues, miniskirt and over-knee tights. I actually ended up liking the clothed option so much I made it into her main outfit. The clothed part is like the whole process again on top of the finished bikini model drawing. Since you've seen the whole process once, I think we can move on to Part 3. The import file. The art is done and we have literally thousands of layers and our computer is most likely burning. But we can't start rigging just yet. At this point in the process, I usually copy my artwork file and continue to work on the copy. Now we'll start being destructive. We will start merging layers and lose the option to manipulate individual things like the shadows or the highlight on its own. Remember how I said I had several layers per part, one for the outline, backline, base color, shadows, etc.? We need to make these into one for each part. This is why it's better to take extra care and make something that needs the least amount of backtracking possible. So this part is pretty simple but mandatory. Also, we need to name each layer in a meaningful way and clean up the artwork thoroughly. With the Photoshop outline effect, I can quickly see if there are any stray pixels on each layer. If we don't erase these, they will cause problems later in the rigging program, so let your inner OCD go wild. If we end up making a mistake at this stage, like merging the wrong layers or wanting to give a certain shadow another hue or something, there is no way we can fix that, unless we've made a copy before the merging process had been made. In that case, I open up the original, make changes to the artwork without merging anything, copy the layers and paste them into the import file for the rig, then merge. This way we don't need to redraw something because we lost the layered original. Do pay attention to the naming of layers. Two layers with the same name will destroy the rig. After I have carefully prepared the import PSD, we can finally proceed to Part 4, the rig. At first, we import our prepared PSD into Live2D. In Live2D, the parts will be individually deformed and these transforms will be linked to parameters to create an animation. We set different transforms on keys on these parameters and Live2D will create a smooth linear movement between two keys. Got it? That's basically everything. But let's go through every step one by one. Just like there are polygons that make up a 3D object, Live2D has a 2D equivalent known as art mesh. The more triangle a character consists of, the smoother it will look. The same is true in this software. In order to be able to transform our drawing into different shapes and make it look smooth while doing so, we need to add an art mesh with sufficient triangles. For parts that don't need big transformations, we don't need to add a lot. For those that will get a lot of squash and stretch, the more triangles the merrier. That step has to be repeated until every last layer has gotten an art mesh. However, we can always come back to remesh if we miscalculated how many triangles we need or at what position. After setting up my art meshes, I set up a deformer hierarchy next. In our hierarchy, we have our art meshes and different kinds of deformers. We group different art meshes into different deformers, and deforming this particular deformer will deform anything that's grouped beneath it. If we move the upper leg, for example, we want the lower leg and the hoof also to move with it. Each parameter that moves a piece needs its own deformer. This is why the hair gets 3 to 4 deformers on top of each other instead of just one. This way we can set up an efficient hierarchy. If you're new to Live2D and need a guide on how to set up a good hierarchy, take a look at the sample data on the Cubism website. It might be overwhelming at first, but it is actually pretty simple. Live2D is a Japanese program that was most likely created for the need of making easy character animations for visual novel games. It evolved over time to be the most popular software to make models for face tracking. Outside of that scope, it has pretty limited use cases though. Besides Live2D, there are other programs for 2D modeling, like Spine, that offer a lot of features for making games and integrations into game engines. Live2D is certainly a niche program, but nevertheless best suited for making face-tracked models. This is why I'm working with Live2D. After everything is set up, we can start adding keys to parameters. When creating a new model, default parameters are created with it. Parameters control a certain action of the character, like looking up, down or sideways. Later, we can combine multiple parameters to create believable movement. To add movement to our parameters, we select the deformer we want to manipulate and set keyforms. When the slider is at the green dot, we can now change the deformer in our desired shape. We test out the movement by dragging the dot on the slider and adjust what doesn't feel right. Besides deformers, we can also manipulate the order of the layers and transparency. Step by step, this is how we manipulate our drawing to move and give off an illusion of 3D. There's not a lot of magic to it, other than the ability to create a good 3D illusion. The default parameters a newly created model comes with are also the ones that are used by most tracking softwares by default. This is why we will be utilizing them too. The movements include head and body movement on 3 axes, eyes open in form, eyeball position and mouth open in form, and brows. And of course we can add any parameters we want. I added a parameter that controls her clothing and tail movement, for example. Over the course of the recording, you can see I'm taking one after another. Each part that gets deformed by a parameter needs its own individual deformer, so more parameters equal a significantly bigger workload. This is why complex models with lots of parameters will cost a lot if you commission them. Sadly, there aren't a lot of time savers the rigger can utilize, so rigging is quite expensive. If you're on a budget, you should think about limiting the model's parameters and the details that should move on their own. For a face tracking model, the basic movement is needed to work, of course. For example, Eliza has eyes with eyeballs that move individually and even the iris is animated. The chibi model I've rigged before has just big round dots for eyes, therefore it was faster and cheaper to make. Certain parts of a character would jiggle from movement, like clothing or the demon wings. We create extra parameters and deformers for the physics movement of each part. Just like the other parameters, we set keyforms. That way we create hair strands that swing from left to right, for example. In the physics settings, we can set a source parameter that triggers the physics movement. To see if it works, we can slide the parameter we've chosen as source on the right. Honestly, it's easier than UI looks and gives a great effect for little work. Sooner or later, we need to generate a proper texture image from our imported PSD. Just like 3D objects, our 3D model needs a texture too. This is called Texture Atlas in Live2D, and here we can place our individual parts to our liking. The size of the texture atlas and how much space it occupies determines the pixel resolution of each part. Parts that get distorted a lot should therefore take up more space than others, like the eyebrows or the mouth, for example. We can preview the export resolution by pressing T on the keyboard. Without a texture atlas, we can't export our model. If you ask yourself, do I need to be able to draw to make good models? The answer is yes and no. You don't need to be able to draw well, but on the other hand, the skills needed to draw well will most likely benefit you greatly. You'll need to imagine well how objects would change shape in 3D space to make a believable deformation with the 2D drawing. Live2D is less technical than you first get the impression it is. It is more technical than a drawing program, but not much more than that. You can be able to understand all the tools of the program and still not produce a single good deformation because you lack imagination. In that sense, Live2D is a lot harder than modeling a 3D object because that will look 3D on its own and is not tied to your skill. Of course, 3D programs are a lot more complex in the technical department. However, we want to produce a cute character with a great 2D look. Animation skills are also beneficial, though these get more important if you want to do custom animations with your model later. When tied to face tracking, your model will mimic face expression and will have a natural feel to them from the start. For that, you don't need much knowledge in animation. As I mentioned earlier, my model is mostly symmetrical to save time. As you can see, I turned off the eye and horn on one side. I'll work on these and build every parameter deformation they are used in first. After completion, I copy them over so I don't need to do it twice. However, if an error is found after copying, I would need to redo the whole copying process. This is why I saved this step for the very end. Everything the copied elements are involved in needs to be perfect first, or I would need to redo a lot of work, like the head movement for the eyes. I wanted to give Eliza several arms and hand poses she can use to make a varied amount of gestures. However, I've run out of time to make them all, and for now she can only wave. I hope to come back to her later to add some more. After we configured all the parameters we need for the model, we can create custom animations and expressions. A cheap way to give our model more personality are expressions. Expressions set one to several parameters to a certain value. This way we can create something like a character blushing. One of my parts is a blush layer that adds red overlay over Eliza's face. I've set a parameter that controls the transparency of this blush layer. 0 for 0 opacity and 1 for 100% opacity. In the tracking program, we can assign this to a hotkey or button to make Eliza blush on command. Animations are a little more tricky. For these, Live2D comes with an animator feature where we can edit parameters in a timeline to create complex movement. Since Eliza barely has animations, there's not much for me to show you. However, it's good to know it exists, and when I can come back to add more animations to Eliza, I'll show you. Animations can be tied to a hotkey in the tracking software as well. Pressing the button will result in our character playing the animation, like by wing. That said, our rigging work is coming to a close, the model is looking good, so we can export it and test it out in face tracking software. To export a model for face tracking, it should be exported as Mach3. This exports the interactive model and not a video or picture. However, the settings of the export depend on the face tracking software, so read the manual to avoid frustration. After we exported our model, it is ready for Part 5. The tracking. Not every face tracking software supports Live2D models, so you should be on the lookout for those that do. My tool of choice is VTube Studio. It's simply the best on the market right now in my opinion. VTube Studio works with the regular webcam on PC, Mac, or can utilize your Android or iPhone smartphone to track your face. Due to dedicated hardware, the iPhone tracking is currently the best, but webcam tracking works well too. VTS has a dedicated folder where we can put our model so it'll be loaded by VTS when we start the program. Then just navigate to the model button and choose your custom model. I've made a small avatar for Eliza too. Afterwards, I'll adjust and test the model settings and we're good to go. For webcam tracking, just activate your webcam, make a few funny faces and ta-da! That's it! Of course, I've only skimmed the surface of the available settings in VTS. If you want to load your own model, you should follow along with the official VTS manual. That's it! The model is working and is ready to be used. If you liked this video, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment. Making this video took a lot longer than I thought it would, so if you enjoyed it, please let me know. I'm also open to criticism if you feel anything was bad or something. I want to improve. I didn't intend this to be a full-blown Live2D tutorial, but rather an introduction to the different steps and roughly what I do on each one. If you're interested in a real hands-on detailed tutorial, tell me. Thanks for watching, kittens, and see you next time. Bye!